The world, at roughly 15,000 years before the present, existed in a state not of stability, but of suspended transformation, a planet still gripped by the immense, slow-breathing machinery of the late last glacial maximum, where colossal ice sheets, kilometers thick and continent-spanning, pressed down upon North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia, reshaping not only the land beneath them, but also the climate systems of the entire Earth, redirecting wind currents, lowering global sea levels by over 100 meters, and exposing vast corridors of land that no longer exist today, including the now submerged bridge of Beringia, across which human populations had already passed generations earlier, dispersing into the Americas and continuing southward into landscapes that ranged from tundra to temperate woodland to open grassland, each biome presenting both opportunity and relentless challenge. Across these continents, humanity existed not as a single narrative, but as a mosaic of small, adaptive societies, hunter-gatherer groups whose survival depended on an intimate, almost total awareness of their environments, tracking migratory herds of megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, giant deer, and woolly rhinoceroses, species that themselves were living on borrowed time as the climate began its slow pivot toward warming, a shift that was neither linear nor gentle but punctuated by abrupt cold reversals and unpredictable ecological shifts, forcing human populations into a constant state of recalibration, where knowledge was not written but remembered, not stored but embodied in oral tradition, ritual, and instinct, and where technological innovation, though subtle by modern standards, represented profound leaps, refined stone tools, bone implements, tailored clothing, and increasingly sophisticated methods of cooperative hunting that blurred the line between survival and strategy. In regions such as Western Europe, the final expressions of Paleolithic artistry reached a kind of quiet culmination, with cave systems like those found in what is now France and Spain, housing intricate layered depictions of animals, symbols, and abstract forms. Visual records that were not mere decoration, but part of a deeper cognitive and cultural framework, suggesting that these societies were not only surviving, but interpreting their world, embedding meaning into stone walls in a way that transcended immediate utility, while in other parts of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, parallel developments unfolded in different forms, shaped by entirely different climates and ecologies, yet bound by the same underlying human drive to understand, adapt, and endure. Meanwhile, the great ice sheets themselves began, almost imperceptibly at first, to retreat, initiating processes that would ripple across millennia. Meltwater floods carving new river systems, coastlines beginning their long submergence, ecosystems shifting in composition and distribution, and with them, the patterns of human movement and settlement, as groups followed not only the animals they hunted, but the changing rhythms of the land itself, gradually expanding into territories that had been previously uninhabitable, setting the stage for the profound transformations that would define the next chapters of human history, where the end of the Ice Age would not simply mark a climatic transition, but the opening of a new relationship between humanity and the Earth. A relationship that, though still fragile and undefined at this moment, was already beginning to move towards something more permanent, more structured, and ultimately, more consequential. The world between 14 and 13,000 years ago did not transition gently out of ice, but lurched, pulsed, and convulsed through a series of climatic oscillations that, while subtle in geological terms, were existential in human experience, as warming phases expanded forests into what had once been barren periglacial zones. Rivers swelled with meltwater and coastlines, still far removed from their modern positions, began to creep inward, reshaping the geography of entire continents, while across the northern hemisphere, ecosystems entered a state of rapid reorganization, forcing both animal populations and the humans who depended on them into patterns of movement that were less predictable, less seasonal, and increasingly complex. In the region known today as the Levant, a profound shift quietly unfolded, one that did not announce itself with monuments or written records, but would, in retrospect, mark one of the most consequential turning points in human history, as the Natufian culture began to experiment with a way of life that blurred the boundary between mobility and permanence, establishing semi-sedentary villages composed of circular stone dwellings, returning seasonally, then more frequently, to the same locations, harvesting wild cereals such as barley and wheat, not merely as opportunistic foragers, but with an emerging awareness of seasonal cycles and ecological management, storing food in ways that implied planning beyond immediate survival, and, perhaps most significantly, altering their relationship to land from one of passage to one of attachment. This transition, however, did not occur in isolation, nor was it uniform. Across Eurasia, human groups continued to operate within highly mobile frameworks. Yet even within these, subtle innovations accumulated. More refined microlithic tools, composite implements, and increasingly efficient hunting strategies that reflected a growing sophistication in both technology and social coordination. While in East Asia, populations adapted to riverine and coastal environments with an expanding reliance on fishing and plant gathering, indicating a diversification of subsistence strategies that reduced dependence on large game, particularly as many megafaunal species began their slow decline, a process driven by the combined pressures of climatic instability and human predation, though the precise balance of these forces remains a subject of ongoing investigation. In the Americas, human populations, still relatively recent arrivals in many regions, continued their rapid dispersal, moving into South America and occupying a remarkable range of environments, from high-altitude Andean zones to dense tropical forests and open plains, leaving behind archaeological signatures that suggest both adaptability and ingenuity, as groups developed regionally distinct toolkits and survival strategies, navigating landscapes that were themselves in flux, where glacial retreat opened new corridors, even as changing climates altered the distribution of flora and fauna, creating a dynamic and often unpredictable world in which knowledge had to be constantly updated, recalibrated, and shared. Yet beneath these regional variations, a deeper, more unifying transformation was taking place, one that existed not in any single innovation, but in the accumulation of many small shifts in behavior, perception, and organization, as humans began, almost imperceptibly, to step into a new role within their ecosystems, no longer solely as participants moving through pre-existing natural cycles, but as agents beginning to influence, shape, and in some cases stabilize those cycles, whether through repeated harvesting of specific plants, selective pressures on animal populations, or the establishment of places that, through repeated use, began to acquire a form of permanence, both physical and symbolic. And yet, this movement toward stability would soon encounter resistance from the Earth itself, as the warming trend that had enabled these developments would be interrupted by one of the most abrupt climatic reversals of the late Pleistocene, an event known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden reversion to near glacial conditions that would test the resilience of these emerging lifeways, challenge the viability of early sedentism, and force humanity, once again, to confront the reality that the ground beneath its feet, both literal and conceptual, was far less stable than it had begun to assume. The momentum toward warmth, toward stability, toward something resembling permanence, did not continue. It broke, abruptly and without warning, as the Earth entered the climatic anomaly known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden and severe return to near-glacial conditions that unfolded not over millennia, but within the span of a few human generations, collapsing the fragile ecological gains of the preceding period and reintroducing cold, aridity, and environmental unpredictability into regions that had only recently begun to soften, as advancing tundra replaced forest, as drying conditions reduced the availability of wild cereals, and as the rhythms upon which emerging semi-sedentary communities had begun to rely were disrupted with a force that revealed just how precarious their foothold had been. Across the Levant, where the Natufian culture had tentatively explored a more settled existence, the consequences were immediate and profound, as declining plant yields and shifting animal migrations rendered fixed or semi-fixed settlements increasingly unsustainable, compelling many groups to abandon or partially revert from their sedentary tendencies, dispersing once more into more mobile lifeways, yet not entirely erasing what had been learned. Because even as these communities moved, they carried with them a cognitive and cultural residue of settlement, knowledge of seasonal cycles, of plant harvesting, of place-based living, that would not disappear, but instead remain latent, waiting for conditions to once again make such strategies viable. Elsewhere, across Eurasia and into the Americas, the Younger Dryas imposed a similar pattern of disruption layered over regional variation, as human groups accustomed to increasingly diverse and stable resource bases were forced to recalibrate under conditions that favored resilience over optimization, flexibility over specialization, and mobility over permanence, while the ongoing decline, and in many regions, final disappearance, of megafaunal species accelerated, removing not only a key food source but a structural component of entire ecosystems, thereby altering vegetation patterns, predator-prey dynamics, and the broader environmental context in which human survival strategies operated, creating a cascading effect in which both climate and biology were shifting simultaneously, compounding uncertainty. In North America, the period aligns with the cultural expressions often associated with the Clovis culture, known for its distinctive fluted projectile points and wide geographic distribution. Yet even here, the archaeological record hints at transition and possible fragmentation, as post-Clovis technologies and regional diversification suggest that whatever coherence existed within these early populations was being reshaped, whether by environmental pressures, changing prey availability, or internal social evolution, into a more complex and localized mosaic, where adaptation was no longer simply about following herds, but about navigating a world in which the rules themselves were changing. And yet, within this period of apparent regression, this return to cold, to scarcity, to movement, there existed a paradoxical advancement, not in infrastructure or visible complexity, but in the depth of human knowledge and memory, as societies that had briefly experienced the threshold of settlement now understood, in a way that their ancestors had not, both the potential and the fragility of such a transition, storing within their cultural frameworks not only techniques but expectations, not only practices but possibilities, so that when the climate would once again shift, as it inevitably would, they would not be starting from nothing, but from a remembered near future that had already once almost arrived. This was not the end of an experiment, but the interruption of one, a pause imposed by planetary systems that were still stabilizing after tens of thousands of years of glaciation. And in that pause, humanity was forced into a deeper form of adaptation, one that extended beyond tools and subsistence into the realm of long-term resilience, where survival depended not only on responding to immediate conditions, but on retaining, across generations, the knowledge of how to respond when those conditions changed again, because the lesson of this period, written not in text but in lived experience, was unmistakable. The world could shift suddenly, violently, and without warning, and only those who could remember beyond the present would be able to shape what came next. The cold did not linger. It released rapidly and almost violently as the Earth emerged from the constraints of the Younger Dryas and entered the early phase of the Holocene, a transition so swift in geological terms that entire ecosystems, long compressed by ice and aridity, expanded outward in a surge of biological and climatic reorganization. As temperatures rose, precipitation patterns stabilized, and the vast ice sheets that had dominated the northern hemisphere entered accelerated retreat, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater that fed swelling rivers, formed new lakes, and initiated the slow but inexorable rise of global sea levels, submerging low-lying plains and erasing land bridges such as Beringia, thereby isolating populations that had once moved freely between continents. This was not merely a climatic improvement, but a structural transformation of the planet's operating system, as the stabilization of temperature and seasonal cycles created conditions in which predictability, long absent or unreliable, became an emergent property of the environment, allowing plant communities to establish more consistent growth patterns, animal populations to settle into more stable ranges, and human groups, carrying with them the hard-earned memory of previous instability, to once again approach the threshold of permanence, this time with a deeper understanding of both its potential and its risks. In the Fertile Crescent and surrounding regions, the descendants of those earlier semi-sedentary populations began to reassemble around resource-rich zones, but now under conditions that were far more conducive to sustained habitation, as wild cereals grew more densely and reliably, encouraging repeated harvesting and, increasingly, forms of intentional cultivation that blurred the distinction between foraging and farming, while architectural forms evolved from temporary or seasonal structures into more durable dwellings, signaling not just repeated occupation but continuous presence, and with it the early foundations of community, territory, and shared identity tied not to movement across landscapes but to specific places within them. Elsewhere across the globe, parallel processes unfolded in distinct, yet conceptually similar ways, as human groups adapted to newly stable environments by diversifying subsistence strategies, fishing intensifying along coasts and rivers, plant processing technologies improving, and social structures becoming incrementally more complex as populations grew in size and density, while in regions such as East Asia, early forms of plant management began to emerge independently. And in the Americas, populations continued to expand and regionalize, establishing cultural patterns that would later give rise to entirely separate trajectories of agricultural development. Yet this period was not solely defined by subsistence and settlement. It also witnessed the emergence of structures that suggest an increasingly complex symbolic and social world, most famously represented by sites such as Göbekli Tepe, where massive stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, carved with intricate animal motifs, were constructed by groups who had not yet fully transitioned to agriculture, implying that the capacity for organized labor, shared belief systems, and large-scale construction preceded, or at least evolved alongside, the domestication of plants and animals, challenging earlier assumptions about the sequence of human development and suggesting that the desire to gather, to ritualize, and to create meaning in shared spaces may have been as fundamental to the formation of civilization as the need to secure food. And so, within this 1,000-year span, the world did not simply recover from the volatility of the late Ice Age. It reorganized into a new equilibrium, one defined by relative climatic stability, rising seas that reshaped the map into something increasingly recognizable, and human societies that, informed by both memory and opportunity, began to commit to place, to invest in landscapes, and to construct not only shelters but systems of food production, of social organization, of shared belief, that would, over the coming millennia, expand into the complex, interconnected structures we now identify as civilization. This was the true beginning, not of humanity, but of the conditions that would allow humanity to transform the planet in return. The stability of the early Holocene did not simply provide comfort. It created a framework within which entirely new behaviors could emerge, accumulate, and solidify, as climatic predictability transformed the relationship between humans and their environments from one of reactive adaptation into one of anticipatory engagement, where seasons became reliable enough to plan around, plant growth patterns became consistent enough to influence, and landscapes themselves became canvases upon which human intention could begin to act with increasing permanence, initiating what would later be understood not as a single invention, but as a diffuse, multi-regional process of domestication, unfolding unevenly across the globe, yet converging on a shared principle, that certain plants and animals could be shaped, selected, and eventually integrated into human-controlled systems. In the Fertile Crescent, this process reached a critical intensity, as communities that had long harvested wild cereals began, through repeated interaction and selective pressure, to favor traits that were advantageous for human use: larger seeds, non-shattering stalks, predictable growth cycles, gradually transforming species of wild wheat and barley into early domesticated forms, while parallel developments occurred with animals, as species such as goats and sheep were increasingly managed, their movements constrained, their breeding patterns influenced, and their roles within human society expanded beyond immediate consumption into ongoing, renewable resources, marking a transition from hunting to herding that redefined both mobility and resource security. This transformation, however, was neither instantaneous nor universally adopted, as many human groups continued to operate within foraging frameworks, either by necessity or by choice. Yet even among these populations, the influence of emerging agricultural systems began to ripple outward, altering trade networks, territorial boundaries, and social dynamics, as communities that could produce surplus food gained not only stability, but leverage, enabling larger population densities, more complex social hierarchies, and the beginnings of labor specialization, where not every individual was required to participate directly in food acquisition, opening space for new roles: craft production, tool refinement, early forms of leadership and organization, that would gradually layer additional complexity onto human societies. At sites such as Jericho, evidence of these changes becomes increasingly visible, as one of the earliest known continuously inhabited settlements reveals structures that go beyond simple dwellings, including defensive walls and towers that suggest not only permanence, but the emergence of territoriality, resource protection, and organized communal effort, indicating that the shift to agriculture was not merely a subsistence change, but a reconfiguration of human relationships, both with the land and with each other, introducing new forms of cooperation alongside new forms of conflict. Beyond the Near East, similar thresholds were being approached independently, as in parts of East Asia where early rice cultivation would soon begin to take shape, and in Mesoamerica, where the long process that would eventually lead to maize domestication was already being set into motion through the management of wild grasses, demonstrating that the impulse toward domestication was not confined to a single region, but emerged wherever environmental conditions, population pressures, and accumulated knowledge aligned in such a way that the benefits of controlling food sources began to outweigh the flexibility of foraging. And yet, this transition carried with it consequences that were not immediately visible, as the concentration of human populations in fixed settlements introduced new challenges: disease transmission, resource depletion, social inequality that would only become fully apparent over generations, suggesting that the agricultural revolution was not a simple improvement, but a complex trade-off, a rebalancing of risks and rewards that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development, embedding within it both the foundations of civilization and the seeds of its future tensions. Thus, within this 1,000-year span, humanity crossed a threshold that was less visible than the construction of monuments or the rise of cities, yet far more consequential as the act of domestication, of plants, of animals, and ultimately of landscapes themselves, initiated a feedback loop in which human activity began to shape the environment in increasingly profound ways. And in turn, those altered environments began to shape human societies, creating a dynamic system of mutual influence that would, over the millennia to come, expand in scale, intensity, and complexity, transforming not only how humans lived, but what it meant to be human in a world that was no longer entirely wild. The transition into agriculture did not conclude with its discovery. It intensified, expanded, and began to accumulate consequences, as the early domestication processes initiated in the previous millennium entered a phase of consolidation, refinement, and geographic spread, transforming scattered experiments into increasingly reliable systems, and with them, reshaping not only subsistence strategies, but the very structure of human life. As populations grew in both size and density, settlements expanded from clusters of dwellings into proto-communities with recognizable spatial organization, and the rhythms of daily existence became increasingly synchronized with the cycles of cultivation, storage, and seasonal labor, embedding time itself into a framework of expectation rather than uncertainty. Across the Near East, agricultural practices became more consistent and more deliberate, as domesticated varieties of wheat and barley continued to diverge from their wild ancestors, their genetic trajectories now intertwined with human intention, while herd management of goats and sheep evolved into more structured systems, including controlled breeding and seasonal movement patterns that balanced grazing with land sustainability, creating a feedback loop in which human communities became not only dependent on these resources, but actively responsible for their maintenance. a responsibility that necessitated longer-term planning, coordination, and the transmission of increasingly complex knowledge across generations. Settlements such as Çatalhöyük, though emerging slightly later within this broader timeframe, represent the trajectory already underway, where densely packed dwellings constructed of mud brick formed continuous architectural landscapes without streets in the modern sense, access occurring through rooftops, and interiors richly adorned with symbolic imagery, suggesting that as physical proximity increased, so too did the complexity of social relationships, ritual practices, and shared cultural frameworks, creating environments in which identity was no longer defined solely by kinship or mobility, but by participation in a fixed communal space that persisted beyond any single individual's lifetime. Beyond Southwest Asia, similar processes of intensification unfolded independently, as in parts of East Asia where early rice cultivation began to take shape along river systems, particularly in regions associated with the Pengtushan culture, where wetland environments were increasingly managed to support plant growth, indicating not only domestication, but environmental modification on a scale that required coordinated labor and shared knowledge, while in other regions, including New Guinea, early forms of plant cultivation suggest that the impulse toward agriculture was not a singular event, but a convergent phenomenon arising under diverse ecological conditions. Yet with this increasing permanence came new forms of vulnerability, as larger, denser populations created conditions conducive to the spread of disease, even in its early, less virulent forms, while reliance on a narrower range of food sources introduced risks associated with crop failure, environmental fluctuation, or overexploitation of local resources, revealing that stability, while advantageous, was never absolute, and that the systems being constructed, however advanced relative to what had come before, remained deeply intertwined with the same environmental forces that had shaped human existence for tens of thousands of years. Socially, the implications of this shift began to manifest in subtle but significant ways, as the management of surplus, of stored grain, of managed herds, introduced questions of distribution, ownership, and authority, laying the groundwork for emerging hierarchies that, while not yet formalized into rigid class systems, nonetheless indicated that access to resources could be uneven and that leadership, whether based on experience, coordination, or control, was becoming an increasingly necessary component of community organization, further differentiating this new mode of existence from the more egalitarian structures often associated with highly mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Thus, within this millennium, humanity did not simply continue along the path of domestication, it deepened it, embedding agricultural practices into the core of daily life, expanding settlements into more complex and enduring forms, and initiating social dynamics that would, over time, crystallize into the institutions of governance, economy, and culture that define later civilizations, all while navigating the persistent tension between control and dependence as humans increasingly shape their environments, even as those environments continued to shape them in return. As the agricultural foundation laid in previous millennia continued to stabilize and expand, the human world began, almost imperceptibly at first, to fragment, not into isolation, but into differentiation, as communities that had once shared broadly similar survival strategies started to develop distinct regional identities, shaped by their specific environments, available species, and accumulated cultural knowledge, creating a patchwork of emerging lifeways that, while still connected by the underlying logic of domestication and settlement, were increasingly unique in their expression, their tools, their social structures, and their relationship to the landscapes they inhabited. In Southwest Asia, agricultural systems became more entrenched and diversified, as domesticated crops and animals were refined further and integrated into increasingly complex cycles of production and storage, while settlements expanded in both size and permanence, evolving into structured communities with designated spaces for living, working, and ritual, indicating a growing sophistication not only in subsistence, but in spatial organization and social coordination, as the management of surplus, labor, and resources required systems of decision-making that extended beyond immediate kinship ties and into broader communal frameworks. It is within this period that one of the most transformative technological developments began to take hold: the widespread emergence of pottery, particularly associated with cultures such as the Jomon culture in East Asia, where some of the earliest known ceramic vessels appear, not merely as functional containers, but as artifacts bearing intricate patterns and designs, suggesting that even in this early stage, utility and expression were intertwined, as the ability to store liquids, preserve food, and cook more efficiently expanded dietary possibilities and reduced vulnerability to short-term scarcity, while simultaneously introducing a new medium through which identity, tradition, and aesthetic sensibility could be expressed and transmitted. Across East Asia more broadly, agricultural practices continued to develop along distinct trajectories, with rice cultivation gradually intensifying in wetter regions, while millet and other crops were cultivated in drier zones, demonstrating that the agricultural revolution was not a single uniform process, but a series of parallel innovations adapted to local conditions, each contributing to the diversification of human societies and reinforcing the emerging pattern of regional specialization. In the Americas, populations that had spread widely across both North and South America began to settle into more regionally distinct cultures, adapting to environments ranging from coastal fisheries to inland plains and high-altitude regions, developing specialized tools, subsistence strategies, and social structures that reflected the diversity of these landscapes, while in regions such as the Andes, early forms of plant management hinted at future agricultural developments that would later support complex societies, even as many groups maintained a balance between mobility and settlement that allowed for both flexibility and continuity. Meanwhile, in Europe, the gradual spread of agricultural practices from the Near East began to interact with existing hunter-gatherer populations, creating zones of cultural exchange, adaptation, and sometimes tension. As different lifeways coexisted, overlapped, and influenced one another, leading to hybrid systems in which elements of farming and foraging were combined, demonstrating that the transition to agriculture was not a simple replacement, but a negotiation, a process in which old and new ways of life were continuously adjusted in response to both environmental conditions and social dynamics. And underlying all of these developments was a deeper, more structural shift in how human societies understood themselves, as identity became increasingly tied not only to movement or lineage, but to place, to practice, and to shared systems of knowledge that were now being preserved and transmitted within more stable communities, allowing traditions to accumulate, technologies to refine over generations, and cultural distinctions to deepen, setting the stage for a world in which humanity was no longer a relatively uniform species of highly adaptable foragers, but a constellation of distinct societies, each following its own trajectory while remaining part of a larger, interconnected human story. Thus, within this millennium, the foundations of diversity, technological, cultural, and social, were firmly established, creating the conditions for the emergence of increasingly complex and differentiated civilizations in the millennia to come, as the human world, once defined by shared necessity, began to unfold into a spectrum of possibilities shaped by both environment and imagination. By 8,000 years ago, the human world, once defined by isolation, distance, and the limits of direct experience, had begun to weave itself into something more interconnected, not through any centralized system or deliberate global design, but through countless small acts of movement, exchange, and interaction as communities, now more permanently rooted to specific locations, found themselves both constrained by and enriched through contact with others, giving rise to the earliest forms of trade networks, where materials, ideas, and practices began to travel beyond the boundaries of their place of origin, creating a subtle but profound shift in how human societies related not only to their environments, but to each other. In regions such as Anatolia and the Near East, settlements grew not only in size but in influence, as access to certain materials, particularly obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharpness and utility, became a driver of interaction, with sites like Çatalhöyük participating in exchange networks that transported obsidian across considerable distances, indicating that even in this early stage, human communities were capable of maintaining connections that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings, facilitated by knowledge of roots, relationships between groups, and an emerging understanding of value that was not solely based on immediate survival, but on utility, rarity, and desirability. This movement of materials was accompanied inevitably by the movement of ideas, as technologies such as pottery styles, tool-making techniques, and agricultural practices spread along these informal networks, adapting as they moved, merging with local traditions, and creating hybrid forms that reflected both origin and destination, while in Europe, the gradual diffusion of farming practices continued, carried not only by migrating populations, but also through cultural transmission, as neighboring groups adopted, modified, or resisted these new systems based on their own needs and conditions, resulting in a complex mosaic of lifeways that defied simple categorization. In East Asia, similar patterns of interaction emerged, as communities engaged in regional exchange, sharing not only material goods, but also knowledge related to cultivation, fishing, and craft production, while in parts of the Americas, long-distance movement of materials, such as certain types of stone used for tools, suggests that even without domesticated pack animals or wheeled transport, human networks were capable of extending across vast landscapes through a combination of direct travel and multi-stage exchange, where goods passed from one group to another in a chain that connected distant regions without requiring any single individual to traverse the entire distance. Yet these networks were not merely economic. They were social and cultural, creating pathways through which not only goods, but also beliefs, symbols, and practices could travel, contributing to the gradual emergence of shared motifs and ideas across regions, even as local identities remained distinct, suggesting that early human societies were beginning to participate in something larger than themselves, a loosely connected web of interaction that, while lacking the speed or scale of later trade systems, nonetheless represented the first steps toward a more integrated human world. At the same time, the existence of these networks introduced new dynamics, as access to external resources could influence local power structures, creating advantages for certain communities or individuals who were positioned along key routes or who controlled valuable materials, hinting at the early formation of inequalities not only within societies but between them, as connectivity became both an opportunity and a source of tension, a pattern that would only intensify in the millennia to come. Thus, within this millennium, humanity extended itself beyond the limits of immediate geography, constructing not roads or empires, but relationships, fragile, shifting, and often invisible networks that connected distant communities into a broader system of exchange, laying the conceptual and practical foundations for the complex trade systems, cultural interactions, and global interdependencies that would, over thousands of years, evolve into the interconnected world we now inhabit. By 7,000 years ago, the slow accumulation of agricultural practice, settlement permanence, and interregional exchange began to crystallize into something more visibly structured as human communities, no longer tentative experiments in stability, but increasingly confident systems of habitation, expanded in both scale and complexity, transforming villages into dense, enduring settlements that, while not yet cities in the formal sense, exhibited many of the underlying characteristics that would later define urban life. Planned or semi-planned layouts, differentiated spaces for living and working, communal areas, and, perhaps most significantly, the early formation of social hierarchies that extended beyond simple kinship networks into more formalized systems of organization and authority. In regions such as Mesopotamia, where the environmental conditions of the Tigris-Euphrates river system provided both opportunity and constraint, human communities began to engage more intensively with the management of water, developing early irrigation practices that allowed for the expansion of agriculture beyond the immediate reach of natural rainfall, transforming floodplains into productive landscapes capable of supporting larger populations, yet also requiring coordinated labor, planning, and maintenance, thereby reinforcing the need for leadership structures and collective decision-making, as the success of the entire community became increasingly dependent on shared infrastructure. This intensification of agricultural production enabled the generation of surplus at a scale not previously possible, and with surplus came differentiation, as not all members of a community were required to engage directly in food production, allowing for the emergence of specialized roles, craftspeople, toolmakers, builders, and individuals who may have taken on organizational or ritual responsibilities, creating a more layered social structure in which status, function, and access to resources could vary, marking a gradual but significant departure from the more egalitarian dynamics that characterized many earlier societies. Settlements themselves began to reflect this increasing complexity, as architectural variations suggested differences in status or function. Storage facilities became more prominent and centralized, and communal constructions, whether for ritual, storage, or governance, indicated a level of coordination that extended beyond individual households, pointing toward the early formation of institutions, not yet formalized but clearly emerging, that would eventually evolve into systems of governance, religion, and economic control. In other parts of the world, parallel developments unfolded along different trajectories, as in the Indus region, where early agricultural communities laid the groundwork for what would later become one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations, and in China, where river-based societies along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers continued to refine agricultural practices and settlement organization, while in Europe, The spread of farming continued to reshape landscapes and social structures, interacting with indigenous hunter-gatherer populations to produce a complex tapestry of cultural adaptation and exchange. Even in the Americas, where large-scale agriculture was still in its earlier stages, increasing evidence of more permanent settlements and regional specialization suggests that similar processes of social differentiation and structural organization were beginning to take root, indicating that the trajectory toward complexity was not confined to a single geographic region, but was a broader pattern emerging wherever conditions allowed for sustained population growth and resource management. Yet with this growing complexity came new tensions, as the concentration of resources, the emergence of leadership, and the increasing interdependence of community members created both opportunities for cooperation and potential for conflict, as questions of control over land, water, surplus, and labor became more pronounced, introducing dynamics that would, over time, evolve into systems of inequality, competition, and governance that would shape the course of human history in profound and lasting ways. Thus, within this millennium, humanity crossed another threshold, not merely of scale, but of structure, as the loosely organized communities of earlier periods began to coalesce into more defined and enduring systems, laying the groundwork for the first true urban societies, where the interplay of environment, technology, and social organization would give rise to the earliest civilizations. By 6,000 years ago, the gradual layering of agricultural surplus, settlement permanence, and social differentiation began to coalesce into something qualitatively different from what had come before. Not merely larger communities, but organized, enduring systems that approached the threshold of true urbanism, as certain regions, particularly within the fertile corridors of Mesopotamia, witnessed the emergence of settlements whose scale, complexity, and internal organization suggested that humanity was no longer simply adapting to stable environments, but actively engineering them into sustained, self-reinforcing centers of habitation, production, and coordination. Along the vast floodplains of the Tigris-Euphrates river system, communities expanded into proto-cities, where irrigation networks grew more intricate and extensive, transforming unpredictable seasonal floods into managed agricultural systems capable of supporting increasingly dense populations, yet requiring constant maintenance, oversight, and collective labor, thereby embedding governance, however informal at first, into the daily functioning of society, as decisions regarding water distribution, land use, and resource allocation could no longer be made at the level of individual households, but demanded coordination across entire communities. Within these expanding settlements, architectural forms began to reflect increasing specialization and planning, as structures were no longer uniform, but differentiated by purpose. Residential spaces, storage facilities, communal buildings, and early administrative or ritual centers, suggesting that the organization of space itself had become a tool for managing complexity, while the concentration of population created new social dynamics where proximity intensified interaction, cooperation, and conflict alike, giving rise to more clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and, increasingly, distinctions in status and influence. It is in this context that the earliest recognizable proto-urban centers, such as Eridu and Uruk, begin to take shape, sites that would later become foundational to the development of Sumerian civilization, but which in this period already exhibit key features of urban life. Centralized structures that may have served ritual or administrative functions, organized layouts that facilitated movement and coordination, and evidence of large-scale labor mobilization, indicating that these were not simply villages grown large, but new forms of human organization that operated at a different level of complexity. Beyond Mesopotamia, parallel developments continued to unfold along distinct regional trajectories, as in the Indus Valley, where early settlements began to display increasing organization and planning that would later culminate in highly structured urban centers, and in China, where river-based agricultural societies continued to expand and diversify, while in Europe, the spread of farming and settlement gave rise to increasingly complex communities that, while not yet urban in the same sense, nonetheless exhibited growing social and technological sophistication. At the same time, long-distance exchange networks continued to expand and intensify, connecting these emerging proto-cities with surrounding regions and facilitating the flow of materials, technologies, and ideas, reinforcing the interconnected nature of these developments and ensuring that innovation in one area could influence others, creating a dynamic system of diffusion and adaptation that accelerated the pace of change. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation of this period lies not in any single technological or architectural advancement, but in the emergence of systems, of production, of organization, of belief, that operated beyond the scale of individual experience, creating societies that could sustain themselves, adapt, and grow across generations, independent of any one person, embedding continuity into the structure of human life and marking the beginning of a trajectory that would lead, in the millennia ahead, to the full flowering of civilization, with its cities, its institutions, and its increasingly complex relationship with the world it both depended upon and reshaped. Thus, within this 1,000-year span, humanity crossed from complexity into systemization, from large communities into proto-cities, and from loosely organized societies into structured networks of interdependence, laying the foundations upon which the earliest civilizations would soon rise. By 5,000 years ago, the systems that had been forming, slowly, unevenly, but persistently, within the proto-cities of earlier millennia, reached a level of complexity that demanded something entirely new, something that had never before existed in human history: the ability to externalize memory, to move beyond the limits of oral tradition and individual recall, and to create records that could persist independently of those who created them, marking the emergence of writing, not as an abstract intellectual breakthrough, but as a practical necessity born from the increasing intricacy of economic, social, and administrative life. In the growing urban centers of Mesopotamia, particularly within cities such as Uruk, the management of surplus, grain, livestock, labor, had reached a scale at which informal systems of accounting were no longer sufficient, giving rise to early forms of symbolic notation that would eventually develop into cuneiform, where impressions made with reed styluses on clay tablets encoded information about quantities, transactions, and obligations, transforming economic activity into something that could be tracked, verified, and administered across time and space, fundamentally altering the nature of human organization. This innovation did more than record information. It reshaped cognition itself, as the ability to store knowledge outside the human mind allowed for the accumulation of data across generations, enabling more complex planning, more precise administration, and the development of institutions that could operate with continuity and consistency, as rules, transactions, and agreements could now be documented, referenced, and enforced, creating a foundation for governance that extended beyond personal authority and into systems of recorded accountability. At the same time, writing did not emerge in isolation, but alongside other developments that reinforced the growing complexity of urban life. As administrative structures became more formalized, with designated roles for those responsible for managing resources, organizing labor, and overseeing communal projects, while religious institutions, often centered around temple complexes, began to play an increasingly central role in both spiritual and economic life, acting not only as places of worship, but as hubs of storage, redistribution, and coordination, further integrating belief systems with the practical functioning of society. Beyond Mesopotamia, similar processes of increasing complexity were unfolding along different trajectories, as in Egypt, where the early stages of state formation were taking shape along the Nile, supported by predictable flooding patterns that enabled agricultural stability and population growth. While in the Indus Valley, settlements continued to expand and organize in ways that hinted at the highly structured urban systems that would soon emerge. And in China, early cultural developments along major river systems laid the groundwork for future dynastic societies, demonstrating that while the specific forms of writing and administration varied, the underlying pressures driving their emergence were broadly shared. The expansion of trade networks further amplified these developments, as the need to manage long-distance exchange, track goods, and maintain relationships across regions reinforced the value of record-keeping, while also spreading ideas, technologies, and cultural practices between distant societies, contributing to a growing interconnectedness that, while still limited in scope, represented a significant departure from the more localized interactions of earlier periods. And yet, with the emergence of writing and formal administration came new forms of power, as those who controlled the creation, interpretation, and storage of records, scribes, administrators, religious authorities, occupied positions of influence within these societies, shaping not only how resources were managed, but how reality itself was documented and understood, introducing a new dimension to social hierarchy, in which knowledge, as much as material wealth, became a source of authority. Thus, within this millennium, humanity achieved a transformation that was as cognitive as it was structural, crossing from a world in which memory was ephemeral and decentralized into one in which information could be fixed, transmitted, and accumulated, laying the intellectual and administrative foundations for the civilizations that would soon rise to unprecedented levels of complexity, and marking the beginning of recorded history itself, where human societies would, for the first time, begin to write their own story. By 4,000 years ago, the gradual layering of agriculture, settlement, trade, and record-keeping had reached a critical mass, transforming what had once been loosely organized urban systems into something far more consolidated and hierarchical as early states began to emerge, entities defined not merely by population size or architectural scale, but by their ability to exert coordinated authority over territory, resources, and people, embedding power into institutions that could persist beyond individual leaders and extend across increasingly expansive and complex societies. In Mesopotamia, cities such as Uruk and its successors evolved into powerful urban centers, each functioning as both a city and a state, governed by ruling elites whose authority was often intertwined with religious legitimacy as temple complexes and emerging palace structures became focal points of administration, economic control, and ideological influence, coordinating large-scale irrigation systems, organizing labor for construction and agriculture, and managing the distribution of surplus in ways that reinforced centralized authority, while the continued refinement of cuneiform allowed these systems to operate with increasing precision and continuity. At the same time, along the fertile banks of the Nile, a parallel but distinct trajectory unfolded, as the predictable flooding cycles of the river supported the unification of smaller communities into a centralized kingdom that would eventually coalesce into the civilization of ancient Egypt, where authority became increasingly concentrated in the figure of the pharaoh, a ruler whose power was framed not only in political terms, but as a manifestation of divine order, enabling the coordination of vast labor forces for monumental construction projects and the management of agricultural production on a scale that rivaled or exceeded that of Mesopotamian societies, demonstrating that centralized power could take multiple forms while achieving similar outcomes in terms of organization and control. Further east in the Indus Valley, settlements such as Harappa began to exhibit a level of planning and standardization that suggests a highly organized social system with grid-like layouts, advanced drainage systems, and standardized building materials, indicating that centralized coordination, whether political, administrative, or cultural, was already shaping urban development in ways that prioritized efficiency, sanitation, and order, even if the exact nature of governance in these societies remains less clearly understood due to the absence of fully deciphered written records. Across these regions, the emergence of states brought with it a new scale of human organization, as territories expanded beyond single cities to encompass surrounding lands and populations, requiring systems of control that could manage diversity, enforce rules, and maintain stability across distances, leading to the development of early legal codes, taxation systems, and standing administrative structures, all of which contributed to the increasing institutionalization of power. Yet this centralization was not without consequence, as the concentration of authority and resources created new forms of inequality and dependency, where individuals and communities were increasingly integrated into systems that dictated their roles, responsibilities, and access to resources, while also enabling large-scale achievements, monumental architecture, complex infrastructure, and coordinated economic activity that would have been impossible under earlier, more decentralized forms of organization. Thus, within this millennium, humanity transitioned from complex societies into structured states, from localized authority into centralized power, and from informal systems of coordination into institutional frameworks that could govern, organize, and sustain populations on an unprecedented scale, laying the groundwork for the great civilizations that would dominate the next chapters of human history, where the interplay of power, culture, and innovation would shape the trajectory of the ancient world. By 3,000 years ago, the systems of centralized authority, agricultural production, and urban organization that had taken shape in earlier millennia began to accelerate into a new phase defined by technological intensification and territorial expansion, as the widespread adoption of metallurgy, particularly the alloying of copper and tin into bronze, introduced tools, weapons, and implements of unprecedented durability and effectiveness, fundamentally altering not only daily life but the balance of power between societies, enabling the rise of larger, more organized, and increasingly competitive states, whose influence extended far beyond their immediate geographic origins. Across Mesopotamia, successive city-states evolved into larger political entities, culminating in some of the earliest empires, where rulers sought not merely to govern a single city, but to control vast territories, integrating diverse populations through systems of administration, taxation, and military force. While monumental architecture, temples, palaces, and defensive walls expanded in both scale and sophistication, serving not only practical functions, but also as symbols of authority and continuity, reinforcing the legitimacy of ruling elites in a world where power was becoming increasingly centralized and contested. Along the Nile, the civilization of ancient Egypt entered a period of remarkable consolidation and expression, as the Old and Middle Kingdoms saw the construction of monumental structures on a scale that continues to define the ancient world, most famously the pyramids, which, beyond their function as royal tombs, represented the culmination of highly organized labor systems, advanced engineering knowledge, and a deeply embedded belief system that linked political authority with cosmic order, illustrating how technological capability, religious ideology, and centralized power could converge to produce works of enduring significance. Simultaneously, in the Indus Valley, cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reached levels of urban planning and infrastructure that rivaled or exceeded their contemporaries, with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized construction, and evidence of extensive trade networks, suggesting a form of social organization that, while less visibly hierarchical in its material remains, nonetheless achieved a high degree of coordination and efficiency, reflecting a different but equally advanced model of complex society. Beyond these major centers, the Bronze Age world became increasingly interconnected, as long-distance trade networks expanded dramatically, linking regions as distant as Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, facilitating the exchange of not only goods, metals, textiles, ceramics, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, creating a dynamic system of interaction that allowed innovations to spread more rapidly and societies to influence one another in ways that had previously been impossible. Yet this increasing connectivity also introduced new vulnerabilities, as the dependence on long-distance trade for critical resources, such as tin, made societies susceptible to disruptions, while the rise of organized warfare, enabled by improved weaponry and transportation technologies such as the chariot, intensified competition between states, leading to cycles of conflict, expansion, and consolidation that would shape the political landscape of the ancient world for centuries to come. Thus, within this millennium, humanity entered the Bronze Age not simply as a technological phase, but as a transformative era in which metallurgy, empire building, and long-distance exchange combined to create a world that was larger, more interconnected, and more dynamic than ever before, setting the stage for both the achievements and the instabilities that would define the next chapter of human history, where the growth of complexity would bring with it both unprecedented advancement and the seeds of systemic collapse. By 2,000 years ago, the intricate web of Bronze Age civilizations, once defined by interconnected trade networks, centralized authority, and technological sophistication, began to strain under the weight of its own complexity, as systems that had enabled growth and expansion revealed themselves to be fragile, interdependent structures vulnerable to disruption, where the failure of one component, whether environmental, economic, or political, could cascade across regions, triggering widespread instability that, over time, would culminate in what is now understood as the Bronze Age collapse, a period marked not by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of overlapping crises that reshaped the ancient world. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, once powerful states and city networks experienced abrupt decline. As trade routes faltered, urban centers were abandoned or destroyed, and populations were displaced, with archaeological evidence pointing to a combination of factors: climatic shifts leading to drought, internal social unrest, external invasions often associated with groups referred to as the Sea Peoples, and the breakdown of long-distance exchange systems upon which many societies had come to depend, creating a feedback loop of instability in which the loss of resources undermined political authority, and the weakening of political authority further disrupted resource distribution. Yet within this apparent collapse lay the seeds of transformation, as the decline of bronze, dependent on the relatively scarce and geographically limited availability of tin, gave way to the increasing use of iron, a material more abundant yet more difficult to work, whose eventual mastery democratized access to metal tools and weapons, reducing the monopolistic control that elite groups had exercised over bronze production and enabling a broader distribution of technological capability, thereby reshaping the balance of power within and between societies. In the aftermath of collapse, new political entities began to emerge from the remnants of older systems, often smaller, more regionally focused, and in some cases more adaptable, as seen in the rise of early states and kingdoms that would later define the Iron Age world, while in regions such as the Near East, traditions of writing, administration, and cultural expression persisted and evolved, demonstrating that even as systems broke down, knowledge itself remained a durable and transmissible resource. Elsewhere, in regions less directly affected by the collapse or where its effects were absorbed differently, societies continued along trajectories of development that would later intersect with or influence the emerging Iron Age world, as in parts of South Asia and East Asia, where complex societies evolved with their own internal dynamics, contributing to the broader diversification of human civilization during this period of global reorganization. At the same time, patterns of migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange intensified as displaced populations moved into new territories, bringing with them technologies, traditions, and ideas that would merge with local practices, creating hybrid cultures that reflected both continuity and change, while the relative decentralization of power in many regions allowed for experimentation and variation in social organization, setting the stage for the eventual reemergence of larger, more integrated states in the centuries to come. Thus, within this millennium, humanity experienced not merely a decline, but a profound reconfiguration, as the collapse of Bronze Age systems cleared space for new forms of technology, organization, and identity to emerge, marking the transition into the Iron Age, a period in which the lessons of interconnected fragility would coexist with the possibilities of broader access, innovation, and resilience, reshaping the trajectory of human history in ways that would reverberate across the centuries that followed. By 1,000 years ago, the human world had become not merely interconnected, but dynamically entangled, a dense lattice of empires, kingdoms, trade routes, and belief systems stretching across continents, where the accumulated weight of millennia, agriculture, cities, writing, states, and technological adaptation had converged into a global landscape defined by complexity, competition, and cultural synthesis, as the early second millennium unfolded within a framework shaped by the enduring legacies of classical civilizations and the emergent forces that would define the medieval world, where power was distributed across overlapping authorities, political, religious, and economic, each asserting influence within a system that was at once fragmented and deeply interconnected. In Europe, the period following the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire had evolved into a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, where authority was decentralized and layered, with kings, lords, and vassals bound together through systems of obligation and land tenure, while the influence of the Catholic Church extended across political boundaries, providing not only spiritual guidance but also administrative continuity, education, and a shared cultural framework that linked disparate regions into a broader civilizational identity, even as local conflicts, territorial disputes, and shifting alliances created a landscape of persistent instability and negotiation. Simultaneously, the Byzantine Empire persisted as a formidable center of political and cultural power, preserving and transmitting classical knowledge while engaging in complex diplomatic and military interactions with neighboring states, including the expanding influence of the Islamic world, where the Abbasid Caliphate fostered a period of intellectual flourishing, often referred to as the Islamic Golden Age, characterized by advancements in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, supported by extensive trade networks that connected the Middle East with Africa, Europe, and Asia, facilitating not only the exchange of goods, but the transmission of ideas that would shape multiple civilizations. Further east, the Song dynasty oversaw a period of remarkable economic growth, technological innovation, and urban development in China, where advances such as movable-type printing, improvements in iron production, and the expansion of internal and external trade contributed to a highly sophisticated society characterized by large cities, complex bureaucracy, and a vibrant cultural life, while in other parts of Asia, powerful states and empires continued to rise and interact, creating a diverse and dynamic regional landscape. Across the globe, long-distance trade networks, most notably the Silk Road and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean, served as the connective tissue of this world, enabling the movement of goods such as silk, spices, metals, and textiles, while also facilitating the spread of religions, technologies, and cultural practices, creating zones of interaction where ideas could be exchanged, adapted, and transformed, contributing to a gradual but persistent process of globalization long before the term itself would exist. And yet, beneath this intricate web of connection and development, the period was also marked by underlying tensions, religious divisions, political rivalries, environmental pressures, that would, in time, give rise to significant conflicts and transformations, as the balance between stability and disruption remained as delicate as it had been in earlier eras, even as the scale of human systems had expanded dramatically. Thus, within this century, humanity existed within a world that was both richly interconnected and inherently unstable, where the forces of tradition and innovation, unity and division, growth and conflict coexisted in a complex equilibrium, setting the stage for the profound changes that would unfold in the centuries ahead, as the medieval world moved toward new forms of expansion, encounter, and transformation that would ultimately reshape the global landscape. By 900 years ago, the intricate web of medieval civilization, already dense with overlapping systems of faith, trade, and governance, entered a phase of heightened motion, where the forces that had long operated in parallel began to collide more directly, producing a century defined not by isolation, but by convergence, as expanding populations, intensifying religious identities, and increasingly ambitious political entities pushed outward, testing the limits of territory, belief, and power across a world that, while still vast and fragmented, was becoming more interconnected with each passing generation. In Europe, the feudal order persisted, but was no longer static, as population growth and agricultural improvements, such as the heavy plow and the three-field system, supported expanding settlements and rising economic activity, gradually strengthening the position of monarchies and towns at the expense of purely localized lordship, while the authority of the Catholic Church remained immense, shaping not only spiritual life, but political decisions, most visibly through the continuation and expansion of the Crusades, a series of campaigns that projected European power into the Eastern Mediterranean, driven by a fusion of religious zeal, economic ambition, and the desire for prestige, drawing thousands across continents into conflicts that would redefine relationships between Christian and Islamic worlds. In the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, the response to these incursions was not merely defensive, but adaptive, as Islamic states, fragmented yet resilient, reorganized under leaders capable of unifying diverse territories, while cities such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo became focal points of both conflict and cultural exchange, where warfare and diplomacy coexisted with trade and intellectual interaction, reinforcing the paradox of a world in which confrontation and connection were deeply intertwined. Meanwhile, the enduring strength of the Byzantine Empire continued to act as both a buffer and a bridge between Europe and Asia, navigating complex alliances and rivalries even as its territorial integrity faced mounting pressure, illustrating the precarious balance of power that defined the region during this period. Further east, the Song dynasty reached remarkable levels of economic and technological sophistication, as innovations in printing, navigation, and commerce fueled urban growth and expanded trade networks, while a burgeoning merchant class contributed to a dynamic economy that extended beyond regional boundaries, connecting China more deeply to the broader Eurasian system, even as internal pressures and external threats began to loom on the horizon. Across the steppes of Central Asia, a different kind of transformation was quietly taking shape, as nomadic societies, long integrated into the rhythms of trade and migration, began to consolidate under emerging leaders, setting the stage for the explosive expansions that would soon reshape the political geography of Eurasia, demonstrating that the peripheries of established civilizations were not static margins, but active zones of potential upheaval and reconfiguration. At the same time, long-distance trade networks continued to thicken, as the Silk Road and Indian Ocean routes facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas on an ever-increasing scale, creating a world in which events in one region could reverberate across others, linking distant societies into a shared, if uneven, historical trajectory. And yet, beneath this growing connectivity lay tensions that would soon erupt with greater force, as competing powers, expanding populations, and intensifying identities pushed against one another, revealing that the same networks that enabled exchange also carried the potential for conflict, and that the medieval world, far from reaching equilibrium, was accelerating toward a period of even greater transformation. Thus, within this century, humanity moved deeper into a phase of interaction and confrontation, where boundaries were tested, systems were stretched, and the forces of expansion, economic, religious, and political, began to reshape the contours of the known world, preparing the ground for the dramatic shifts that would define the centuries to follow. By 800 years ago, the momentum of the medieval world, its expanding trade routes, intensifying conflicts, and growing populations, encountered a force that would not merely participate in this system, but fundamentally reconfigure it, as the rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan initiated a sequence of conquests that rippled outward across Eurasia with unprecedented speed and scale, collapsing existing political structures, redrawing boundaries, and creating, through both destruction and integration, a new framework of connectivity that would link East and West more directly than ever before. The Mongol expansions, characterized by highly mobile cavalry, sophisticated military organization, and a strategic use of psychological warfare, overwhelmed established states across Central Asia, the Islamic world, and into Eastern Europe, dismantling cities, displacing populations, and absorbing territories into a rapidly expanding imperial system. Yet this process of conquest, while often devastating in its immediate effects, also produced a paradoxical stabilization across vast regions once the initial campaigns subsided, as the Mongols implemented systems of governance that facilitated trade, communication, and the movement of people across what became known as the Pax Mongolica, enabling merchants, envoys, and travelers to traverse distances that had previously been fragmented by political boundaries and insecurity. Across the Islamic world, the Mongol invasions brought both catastrophic destruction and eventual transformation, as major centers such as Baghdad, long a symbol of intellectual and cultural achievement, fell, marking the end of the Abbasid Caliphate's political dominance, even as new regional powers began to emerge in the aftermath, adapting to the altered political landscape and continuing the transmission of knowledge, trade, and cultural exchange within a restructured system that now extended more seamlessly across Eurasia. In Europe, the shock waves of Mongol expansion were felt both directly and indirectly, as incursions into Eastern Europe demonstrated the reach of this new power, while the broader implications of increased connectivity began to reshape economic and cultural life, as goods, ideas, and technologies moved with greater fluidity along revitalized trade routes, linking European markets more closely to those of Asia and the Middle East, contributing to gradual shifts that would, over time, influence the trajectory of European development. In East Asia, the Mongol conquests culminated in the establishment of the Yuan dynasty in China, integrating one of the world's most advanced and populous regions into a broader imperial system where existing administrative practices were adapted and combined with Mongol governance, creating a hybrid structure that facilitated both control and exchange, while also exposing the region to increased external influence. At the same time, figures such as Marco Polo would later traverse these interconnected routes, their journeys emblematic of a world in which the boundaries between distant regions were becoming more permeable, allowing for the transmission not only of goods, but of perceptions, narratives, and knowledge that would shape how different parts of the world understood one another. Yet this new level of connectivity carried within it both opportunity and risk, as the same routes that enabled trade and communication also facilitated the movement of disease, conflict, and instability, embedding within the expanding global network a latent vulnerability that would soon manifest with devastating consequences. Thus, within this century, the world was not simply conquered, it was rewired, as the Mongol expansions dismantled old barriers and constructed new pathways, creating a Eurasian system of interaction that, while born in conquest, would profoundly influence the economic, cultural, and epidemiological dynamics of the centuries that followed, marking one of the most transformative periods of connectivity in human history. By 700 years ago, the vast, newly interconnected world forged in the wake of Mongol expansion entered a period of profound and devastating correction, as the very networks that had enabled the rapid movement of goods, people, and ideas now carried with them an invisible and far more destructive force, culminating in the pandemic known as the Black Death, a disease that moved with unprecedented strat along trade routes stretching from Asia into Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, exploiting the dense, interlinked systems of medieval society to produce mortality on a scale that would permanently alter the demographic, economic, and psychological landscape of entire continents. The arrival of the plague was not a singular moment, but a cascading series of outbreaks, as caravans, ships, and urban centers became vectors through which the disease spread, overwhelming communities that lacked both the medical understanding and the institutional capacity to respond effectively, resulting in mortality rates that, in some regions, approached or exceeded 1/3 of the population, leaving cities partially abandoned, fields untended, and social structures destabilized, as the sudden and widespread loss of life disrupted not only families and communities, but the very systems of labor, production, and governance upon which medieval societies depended. Yet within this devastation lay the seeds of transformation, as the dramatic reduction in population created shifts in economic and social dynamics that would have been impossible under previous conditions, particularly in Europe, where the scarcity of labor increased the relative power of surviving workers, challenging existing feudal structures and contributing to the gradual erosion of rigid hierarchies, as peasants and laborers found new opportunities to negotiate wages, relocate, or alter their social position, initiating changes that would, over time, contribute to the weakening of the feudal system and the emergence of more flexible economic arrangements. At the same time, the psychological and cultural impact of the plague reshaped how societies understood life, death, and the structure of the world itself, as traditional explanations rooted in religion and established authority were tested by the scale and indiscriminate nature of the catastrophe, leading to both intensified religious fervor and, in some cases, skepticism, social unrest, and the search for new explanations, reflecting a broader shift in worldview that would echo into the intellectual transformations of later centuries. Beyond Europe, the effects of the pandemic were similarly profound, as regions across the Islamic world and Asia experienced demographic losses and economic disruption, even as some areas demonstrated resilience or recovery through adaptation and reorganization, illustrating that while the plague was global in its reach, its impacts were shaped by local conditions, governance structures, and existing social systems. Meanwhile, the political landscape continued to evolve in response to these pressures. As weakened states struggled to maintain control, new powers emerged, and existing empires adapted to changing conditions, while trade networks, though disrupted, did not disappear but instead adjusted, continuing to link regions even as the scale and intensity of interaction fluctuated in response to shifting realities. Thus, within this century, humanity experienced one of the most profound demographic and social shocks in its history, as the interconnected systems that had enabled growth and expansion revealed their capacity to amplify catastrophe, forcing societies to confront not only loss, but transformation, as the balance of power, labor, and belief began to shift in ways that would reshape the trajectory of the late medieval world, setting the stage for the gradual emergence of new economic systems, cultural movements, and political structures that would define the transition toward the early modern era. By 600 years ago, the world, still recovering from the demographic and psychological shock of the previous century, began to reorganize itself, not through collapse, but through reawakening, as regions across Eurasia, and particularly in parts of Europe, experienced a convergence of conditions that allowed for the acceleration of intellectual, artistic, and technological development, giving rise to what would later be termed the Renaissance, a movement that, while rooted in the rediscovery and reinterpretation of classical knowledge, was equally a product of contemporary shifts in economy, urbanization, and social structure, as wealth accumulated in emerging city-states and commercial centers provided both the resources and the incentive to invest in art, learning, and innovation. In cities such as Florence, Venice, and others, patronage systems enabled artists, architects, and thinkers to explore new approaches to representation, perspective, and inquiry, producing works that reflected not only technical mastery, but a changing conception of humanity's place within the world, as individuals were increasingly viewed not solely as participants in a divinely ordered system, but as agents capable of observation, creativity, and influence, contributing to a broader intellectual environment in which curiosity and experimentation began to challenge long-standing assumptions. Simultaneously, technological innovations such as the printing press introduced a radical shift in the dissemination of knowledge, as the ability to reproduce texts quickly and in greater numbers expanded access to information beyond elite circles, facilitating the spread of ideas across regions and contributing to the gradual formation of more interconnected intellectual communities, where concepts could be debated, refined, and transmitted with a speed and reach previously unimaginable. At the same time, economic and geographic horizons expanded dramatically as European powers, driven by a combination of commercial ambition, technological advancement in navigation, and the search for alternative trade routes, began to explore beyond familiar boundaries, initiating voyages that would connect continents in new and transformative ways, most notably through figures such as Christopher Columbus, whose journeys across the Atlantic, though rooted in the context of this century's closing years, signaled the beginning of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, an event that would have profound and far-reaching consequences for populations, ecosystems, and global systems of exchange. Beyond Europe, powerful states and empires continued to evolve and expand, as in the Ottoman Empire, which emerged as a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, reshaping regional power dynamics and trade routes, while in Asia, established civilizations such as those in China and India maintained complex societies with their own trajectories of development, contributing to a global landscape that was increasingly interconnected, yet still regionally diverse. The expansion of maritime and overland trade networks further intensified the movement of goods, people, and ideas, linking distant regions into a more cohesive, if uneven, global system, while also introducing new dynamics of competition, colonization, and cultural encounter that would define the centuries to come. Yet this period of renewal and expansion was not without tension, as the forces of tradition and change coexisted uneasily, with established institutions adapting to or resisting new ideas, and the early stages of global exploration introducing both opportunity and conflict, as encounters between previously unconnected societies brought with them not only exchange, but also disruption, inequality, and transformation. Thus, within this century, humanity began to reorient itself, not only intellectually and culturally, but geographically, expanding its awareness of the world and its place within it, setting in motion processes that would lead to the modern era, where the boundaries between regions would become increasingly permeable, and the scale of human interaction would expand beyond anything previously imagined. By 500 years ago, the exploratory impulses that had tentatively extended the edges of the known world in the previous century erupted into a sustained and transformative phase of global interaction, as maritime powers, particularly those of Western Europe, converted discovery into domination, establishing networks of exploration, conquest, and extraction that would bind continents together into the first truly global system, a system defined not only by exchange but by asymmetry, as the movement of people, goods, and ideas occurred within structures of power that increasingly favored those who controlled the seas and the technologies that enabled long-distance navigation. The voyages initiated by figures such as Christopher Columbus were rapidly followed by successive waves of expeditions that extended European presence across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, transforming coastal footholds into expanding zones of influence, where military force, alliances, and disease combined to produce outcomes that reshaped entire civilizations, most dramatically in the Americas, where the arrival of Europeans precipitated demographic collapses among indigenous populations through the spread of Old World diseases, the disruption of existing social structures, and the imposition of new systems of governance and labor that reoriented economies toward external demands. This period also witnessed the consolidation of imperial systems, as Spain and Portugal established vast colonial empires, extracting resources such as silver and gold that would flow across oceans into European and Asian markets, creating economic linkages that connected distant regions into a shared, if unequal, framework of production and exchange, while the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade introduced one of the most consequential and devastating systems of forced migration in human history, as millions of Africans would, over the coming centuries, be transported across the Atlantic under conditions of extreme coercion and suffering, embedding exploitation into the very foundation of this emerging global economy. At the same time, within Europe itself, profound internal transformations were underway, as the Protestant Reformation, initiated by figures such as Martin Luther, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, fracturing religious unity and reshaping political alignments, as states and communities divided along confessional lines, leading to both reform and conflict, and contributing to a broader reconfiguration of authority in which religious, political, and individual identities became more contested and more explicitly defined. Beyond Europe, powerful empires such as the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal states expanded and consolidated their influence, demonstrating that the transformation of the global system was not a unilateral process, but a complex interplay of multiple centers of power, each contributing to and responding to the changing dynamics of trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. While in East Asia, established states continued to operate within sophisticated administrative and economic frameworks that interacted with, but were not entirely subsumed by, the expanding reach of European influence. The circulation of goods, silver from the Americas, spices from Asia, textiles from India, and countless other commodities, flowed through increasingly integrated trade networks, linking markets across continents and creating a level of economic interdependence that, while still uneven and often exploitative, marked a fundamental shift in the scale and scope of human interaction as local economies became increasingly tied to global systems. Yet this emerging global system was not stable. It was dynamic, contested, and often violent, as the processes of colonization, religious transformation, and economic integration introduced new forms of inequality, conflict, and cultural exchange that would shape the trajectory of the modern world, embedding within it both unprecedented connectivity and profound division. Thus, within this century, humanity crossed a threshold into true globality, not as a unified system of cooperation, but as a network of power, movement, and transformation that connected continents in ways that could no longer be reversed, setting the stage for the continued expansion, conflict, and innovation that would define the centuries to follow. By 400 years ago, the global system that had emerged through exploration, conquest, and exchange entered a phase of deepening structure and accelerating transformation as the early modern world became increasingly defined by the interplay of expanding empires, intensifying economic networks, and a profound shift in how humans understood the universe itself, a shift encapsulated in what is now known as the scientific revolution, where long-held assumptions rooted in tradition and authority were subjected to systematic observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning, producing new frameworks of knowledge that would fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with nature, technology, and truth. At the center of this intellectual transformation were figures such as Isaac Newton, whose formulation of the laws of motion and universal gravitation provided a unified explanation for both terrestrial and celestial phenomena, and Galileo Galilei, whose telescopic observations challenged established cosmologies and demonstrated the power of empirical evidence over inherited belief, contributing to a broader movement in which knowledge became increasingly systematized, shared, and refined through emerging networks of scholars, institutions, and publications, enabled in part by the continued expansion of print culture. Simultaneously, the political and economic landscape was undergoing its own form of consolidation and expansion, as European powers extended their colonial reach across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, transforming earlier footholds into structured imperial systems supported by administrative institutions, military force, and economic extraction, while the growth of mercantilist economies and chartered companies, such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, illustrated the increasing integration of state and commerce as private enterprise operated within, and often extended, the ambitions of national power, creating networks of trade and control that spanned continents and oceans. In parallel, the transatlantic slave trade intensified, becoming a central component of the emerging global economy, as enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas to labor in plantations producing commodities such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, embedding systems of exploitation and inequality into the fabric of global trade, while simultaneously generating immense wealth that fueled further expansion and development in European economies, demonstrating the deeply interconnected and often morally fraught nature of this early global system. Within Europe itself, the century was marked by both intellectual advancement and violent conflict, as religious divisions initiated in the previous century culminated in large-scale wars such as the 30 Years' War, a devastating series of conflicts that reshaped political boundaries, weakened traditional authorities, and contributed to the emergence of new concepts of state sovereignty and diplomatic relations, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state system. Beyond Europe, powerful empires such as the Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and Qing dynasties continued to shape regional dynamics, maintaining complex administrative systems, vibrant cultures, and extensive trade networks, interacting with European powers in ways that ranged from cooperation to competition, ensuring that the global transformation of this period remained a multi-centered process rather than a singular narrative of dominance. And underlying all of these developments was a deeper shift in human perception, as the application of scientific reasoning, the expansion of global networks, and the increasing complexity of political and economic systems combined to produce a world that was not only more connected, but more consciously understood, where patterns could be studied, systems could be analyzed, and the future itself could be imagined as something that might be shaped through knowledge and innovation. Thus, within this century, humanity moved decisively toward modernity, as the convergence of science, empire, and global trade created a framework in which the forces that had been building for millennia, knowledge, power, and connectivity, began to operate with a new intensity and direction, setting the stage for the revolutions, industrial transformations, and global realignments that would soon follow. By 300 years ago, the accelerating currents of scientific inquiry, global trade, and political centralization began to converge into a period defined not merely by expansion, but by redefinition, as the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment emerged across Europe and beyond, challenging inherited structures of authority, monarchical, religious, and traditional, with a framework grounded in reason, empirical observation, and the belief that human societies, like the natural world, could be understood, analyzed, and improved through rational thought, producing a wave of philosophical and political ideas that would question not only how power was exercised, but why it existed in its current form at all. Thinkers such as John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau articulated concepts of natural rights, social contracts, and the legitimacy of governance based on the consent of the governed, ideas that, while initially confined to intellectual circles, began to diffuse outward through printed works, salons, and expanding literacy, gradually reshaping public discourse and creating an environment in which existing political systems could be critically examined and ultimately contested. These ideas did not remain theoretical. They ignited transformative political events, most notably the American Revolution, where colonial resistance to imperial authority culminated in the establishment of a new political entity grounded in Enlightenment principles, and the French Revolution, which radically challenged and dismantled entrenched systems of monarchy and aristocracy, demonstrating that the abstract concepts of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty could be translated, often violently, into structural change, reshaping not only national systems, but the global discourse on governance and rights. At the same time, the economic foundations of the world were undergoing their own transformation, as the early stages of the Industrial Revolution began to take shape, particularly in Britain, where innovations in machinery, energy use, and production processes initiated a shift from agrarian economies toward industrialized systems, altering patterns of labor, urbanization, and resource consumption in ways that would soon expand across the globe, marking the beginning of a transition that would redefine the relationship between humans, work, and the environment. Globally, empires continued to expand and compete, integrating Enlightenment ideas unevenly while maintaining structures of control and exploitation, as colonial systems persisted and, in many cases, intensified, demonstrating the paradox of a period in which ideals of freedom and equality coexisted with systems of domination and inequality, reflecting the complex and often contradictory nature of historical change. Thus, Within this century, humanity entered a phase of conscious transformation, where ideas became forces capable of reshaping nations, where revolutions demonstrated the possibility and the cost of systemic change, and where the early machinery of industry began to alter the material foundations of society, setting the stage for the profound economic, political, and social upheavals that would define the modern world, as the structures that had governed human life for centuries were not merely adjusted, but fundamentally reimagined. By 200 years ago, the transformations initiated in the previous century, intellectual, political, and technological, entered a phase of rapid and often disorienting acceleration as the Industrial Revolution expanded beyond its early origins into a global force that reshaped economies, landscapes, and daily life, converting societies that had for millennia been structured around agriculture and localized production into systems driven by mechanization, fossil fuels, and mass manufacturing, where steam engines, factories, and railways redefined not only how goods were produced, but how people moved, worked, and understood their place within an increasingly interconnected and industrialized world. Cities grew at unprecedented rates, drawing populations from rural areas into dense urban centers where labor was organized around the rhythms of machines rather than seasons, creating environments that were simultaneously engines of opportunity and sites of profound social challenge, as new forms of wealth and innovation coexisted with overcrowding, pollution, and stark inequalities, reflecting the uneven distribution of the benefits and burdens of industrialization, while the expansion of infrastructure, railways spanning continents, steamships crossing oceans, compressed distance and time, enabling faster communication, trade, and migration on a scale previously unimaginable. At the same time, industrial power translated into geopolitical expansion as European nations and other emerging powers extended their influence across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific in what is often described as the Age of Imperialism, where technological superiority, particularly in transportation and weaponry, enabled the control of vast territories and populations, integrating them into global economic systems oriented toward the extraction of resources and the expansion of markets, creating a world in which the reach of industrialized states extended far beyond their borders, reshaping local societies and ecosystems in ways that would have lasting consequences. Within this context, scientific and technological innovation continued to accelerate as advancements in fields such as chemistry, electricity, and medicine transformed both industry and everyday life, while figures like Charles Darwin introduced ideas, such as evolution by natural selection, that challenged existing understandings of life itself, contributing to a broader re-examination of humanity's place within the natural world, even as these ideas were interpreted, adapted, and sometimes misapplied within social and political contexts. Meanwhile, social and political movements emerged in response to the changing conditions of industrial society, as workers organized to demand better conditions, rights, and representation, and as movements advocating for abolition, suffrage, and reform challenged existing systems of inequality and exclusion, indicating that the transformations of this period were not only technological and economic, but deeply social, as new ideas about rights, identity, and justice began to reshape public discourse and political action. Globally, migration intensified as millions moved within and between continents in search of opportunity, or under the pressures of economic and political change, further contributing to the interconnection of societies and the blending of cultures, while communication technologies such as the telegraph introduced near instantaneous transmission of information across vast distances, marking another step toward the compression of space and time that would define the modern era. Yet beneath this extraordinary expansion lay growing tensions between industrial and agrarian systems, between imperial powers and colonized regions, between wealth and poverty, and between competing ideologies that would, by the century's end, set the stage for conflicts of unprecedented scale, as the very forces that had driven progress also generated new forms of instability. Thus, within this century, humanity entered fully into the industrial age as the convergence of technology, empire, and social change accelerated the pace of history itself, creating a world that was more connected, more powerful, and more complex than ever before, while also laying the groundwork for the dramatic upheavals that would define the century to follow. By 100 years ago, the accelerating forces of industry, empire, and global interconnection set into motion over the previous centuries reached a threshold at which their scale and intensity could no longer be contained within existing political and social frameworks, erupting into a period defined by unprecedented conflict, rapid technological transformation, and the reorganization of the global order, as the 20th century unfolded not as a linear progression of progress, but as a sequence of shocks, recoveries, and reinventions that would compress human history into one of its most volatile and consequential chapters. The century opened with the catastrophic convergence of industrial capability and geopolitical rivalry in the World War I, where mechanized warfare, trenches, machine guns, artillery, produced destruction on a scale previously unimaginable, reshaping national boundaries and dismantling long-standing empires, only to be followed within a single generation by the even more devastating World War II, a conflict that extended across continents and oceans, culminating in the use of atomic weapons and the realization that human technological power had reached a point where it could alter not only societies, but the very conditions of life on Earth. In the aftermath of these conflicts, the global system underwent a profound restructuring, as colonial empires began to dissolve and new nations emerged, while the ideological and political tension between superpowers defined the Cold War, a period characterized not by direct large-scale conflict between its primary rivals, but by proxy wars, nuclear deterrence, and a pervasive sense of existential risk, as the development of nuclear arsenals introduced a new dimension to human conflict, where the potential for total destruction coexisted with a fragile and uneasy stability. At the same time, technological innovation accelerated at a pace that reshaped nearly every aspect of human life, as advances in medicine, transportation, communication, and computing transformed both the scale and speed of interaction, culminating in the late-century emergence of the Internet, which began to connect individuals and societies in real time across vast distances, creating a new kind of space, digital, instantaneous, and constantly evolving, where information, culture, and identity could be created, shared, and transformed at a rate that defied historical precedent. The century also witnessed humanity's first steps beyond the planet itself, as the space race culminated in the landing of humans on the Moon, extending the scope of human activity into space and redefining the boundaries of exploration. While on Earth, movements for civil rights, decolonization, and social justice challenged entrenched systems of inequality, reshaping societies and expanding the scope of political and personal freedoms, even as new challenges, environmental degradation, economic disparity, and geopolitical instability emerged alongside these advances. And so, by the end of this century, by the threshold of the present, the human world had become something fundamentally different from what it had been even 100 years earlier. A planet-spanning system of unprecedented connectivity, capability, and complexity, where the forces that had shaped history, technology, power, belief, and adaptation, were now operating at a scale that encompassed the entire globe, and where the future, no longer bounded by the slow rhythms of natural change, had become something increasingly shaped by human decision, innovation, and consequence. Thus, within this final segment of the 15,000-year journey, humanity arrives not at an endpoint, but at an inflection point, a moment in which the accumulated momentum of the past converges into a present that is still unfolding, and a future that remains, as it has always been, uncertain, contingent, and profoundly shaped by the choices yet to be made. If the previous 15,000 years can be understood as a gradual accumulation of complexity, of tools, systems, networks, and ideas, then the next 100 may represent something altogether different. Not merely an extension of that trajectory, but a convergence where multiple exponential forces begin to overlap, amplify, and interfere with one another, producing a world that evolves not at the pace of generations, but within the span of single lifetimes, as the early decades of the 21st century give way to a period defined by accelerating technological capability, environmental constraint, and the increasing entanglement of human and machine systems. At the center of this transformation lies the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and computational systems, as algorithms capable of learning, adapting, and generating begin to integrate into nearly every domain of human activity, from scientific research and medicine to governance, economics, and creative expression, raising not only practical questions about efficiency and productivity, but deeper questions about agency, identity, and the nature of intelligence itself as the boundary between human cognition and machine-assisted thought becomes increasingly blurred, creating a feedback loop in which technology shapes human behavior even as human intention shapes technological development. Simultaneously, the physical systems upon which civilization depends, climate, ecosystems, and resource cycles, are entering a period of visible and measurable strain, as the long-term consequences of industrial activity manifest in rising global temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and increasing environmental volatility, forcing societies to confront the limits of growth and the necessity of adaptation, as efforts to transition towards sustainable energy systems, redesign infrastructure, and manage ecological risk become central to both policy and survival, while the uneven distribution of these challenges and solutions introduces new dimensions of inequality and geopolitical tension. In this context, the global system may evolve along multiple overlapping trajectories. One in which technological innovation enables unprecedented levels of efficiency, connectivity, and well-being, potentially extending human lifespan, reducing scarcity, and expanding access to knowledge and opportunity. Another in which the same technologies concentrate power, amplify surveillance, and exacerbate existing inequalities, creating systems that are highly capable but unevenly distributed. and yet another in which environmental pressures and systemic risks disrupt progress, forcing adaptation through constraint rather than choice. Beyond Earth, the expansion of human activity into space, once symbolic and exploratory, may begin to take on a more sustained and functional role as advancements in launch systems, materials science, and life support technologies enable longer-term habitation in orbit and potentially on other celestial bodies, transforming space from a frontier into an extension of the human domain, even as it introduces new legal, ethical, and logistical questions about ownership, governance, and the long-term trajectory of human expansion. At the same time, the nature of human identity and culture may undergo its own transformation as digital environments, virtual spaces, and augmented realities become increasingly integrated into daily life, creating new forms of interaction, expression, and community that are not bound by geography, while also raising questions about authenticity, presence, and the meaning of experience in a world where the line between physical and virtual becomes increasingly permeable. And yet, despite the unprecedented capabilities and uncertainties that define this projected century, one pattern remains consistent with the entirety of the preceding 15,000 years: the interplay between adaptation and transformation, between the forces that shape humanity and the ways in which humanity reshapes those forces in return, suggesting that the future, while influenced by technology, environment, and systems of power, will ultimately be determined not by any single factor, but by the complex and evolving relationship between them. Thus, Segment 25 does not conclude the story. It reframes it as the narrative of human history, once driven by survival, then by settlement, then by expansion and systemization, now enters a phase in which the scale of possibility itself becomes the defining feature, and where the question is no longer simply how humanity will adapt to the world, but how it will choose to shape a world that is increasingly within its capacity to design, alter, and perhaps understand.